I have an opportunity to build 3 laser kits, and these are from G.M.E. laser cut kits. This one is a buckboard, a heavy freight, and this one here is a lumber hay wagon. Now what I've done is I've separated the 3 kits, and there's not a lot of parts to these, but one of the first things to do before separating the laser cut pieces is to take some very fine sandpaper on a block. And what I've done is assemble a piece of sandpaper around a small block of material and lightly sand all the various pieces. Sand with the grain where possible. The wheels themselves doesn't really matter because the grain is in one direction on them. But you don't want to get too deep with the sanding, because things like the floor of the buckboard, for example, and the heavyweight wagon, there's planks in here, and these lines are very, very shallow. We don't want to lose those. One of the nice things that I like about this particular kit is the fact that these laser pieces of wood, of course, naturally are on like a plywood base, but the grain is extremely fine. And it's one of the problems I've seen in other laser kits that I've refused to use is the grain is way too coarse. Some of them it's like a cedar, but it's a very coarse grain, and it's very hard to hide that. These are extremely good. They're very, very smooth, because one of the problems that I don't like on other laser kits is particularly windows, and it would happen with these wheels too if this was very coarse, is the grain would be going across the frame itself, which wouldn't be very realistic. And same thing on the side. Now what I've also done is I've taken a X-Acto blade, and I've put small little grooves and little cut lines in here before I've removed them, and just to give some like split boards. It gives a little added texture that's not actually cut in on the laser. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all these pieces now, and then I'm going to stain them, and I'm going to pre-stain them first, weathered gray, and then we'll decide on how to finish them before assembling. So everything should be pre-stained, pre-finished before any assembling is done. As I said, some laser kits I've seen use cedar, but more commonly they'll use mahogany, being a nice hardwood, but that's where the grain stands out, and you get a lot of the grain showing. Now, the other thing to watch when you buy a kit is to make sure that they've taken the time when they've set up these plates here to cut the pieces, that the grain that is on the wood actually follows the direction of the wood. I've seen some where they completely ignore that, and the grain is in a different angle or different direction. This typically happens, of course, with windows and with door frames, because there's 4 sides in one piece, so the grain has to cross, and that's where you get a problem in seeing that grain. And in this case, this being very, very fine, it looks like it might be basswood. It's also good to keep the grain in one direction. The only place that it fails to a small degree is in these wheels, but because this is such a fine material, you don't get any checking across there at all. Now the idea, of course, to sand this is to remove as much of the burn marks as possible. And this one doesn't have an awful lot of burn marks, but that's the idea of doing a bit of sanding besides smoothing out the grain, is to remove some of the burn marks from the laser. So what I'm doing is I'm taking each of these plates and on a cutting board, and you'll notice that there's generally 1 or 2 little tabs that haven't been cut through to hold the piece in place. So just taking a blade, I use the blade. I don't try to force them out with my fingers, because you could damage the piece. That takes removal of it, and you can see what a nice, beautiful piece of laser work that is. So that's one wheel, and then there's the tiny little sprue right there that's holding that wheel on, and there's only one in each case. Just snap it out, and what I'll do is I'll sand these edges around here afterwards. And you can see where that little light area there, that dark area is where the laser has cut through, and that's where the little sprue was right in here to hold it. And what I'll do is I'll do that with each one. There's the brake pads there, and then this is a little thinner here. These are the seat parts in here, and I'll do the same thing. There's a little carrier right in there, and I'll just cut through each of these. Now, in the process of removing all these parts, I did notice that this particular plate has exactly the problem that I discussed a few seconds ago. The grain is going this way, yet the planks are going this way on all these components, which is going to make it extremely difficult to make this realistic. Even cutting grain across there is not going to work. The other buckboard, or the lumber hay wagon that I haven't got to yet, has framework that goes across the bottom with these supports in here, and again the grain is vertical, so on this wide, it doesn't really matter so much on here if it was across, but on this wide board that's across here, the grain is all vertical, so that's going to kind of ruin that. I may end up replacing these laser cut pieces with scrap lumber, and especially with this, it's not very thick, but I'm sure I can create a replacement piece. I'm going to paint this first and see what it looks like, but I'm not very comfortable that these three pieces here are going to be very successful in the grain unless I put paint on it that's heavy enough to cover the grain. But then the problem is I'm going to end up losing these little lines in here. They're very shallow, and paint is going to fill those. So this is probably not intended to be painted so much as just stained. I'm not too happy about this particular piece, and we'll see what happens. On the buckboard, it has similar pieces, but the grain is running with the board, and that one works. But the problem with the heavy freight and the hay lumber wagon is going to be the same problem. Now, back on the lumber hay wagon, here's the piece here. Now this is going to be fine as well, because see the grain is running across here. One of the tools that I find very handy is this nail file, the nail card that is used to trim your nails, smooth them off, and some come with a coarse side on both sides. Others come with a coarse on one side and a fine on the other. I find this a very handy tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that to trim up, smooth off the surface edge of each of these wheels, because anything else I think the file is going to be maybe too hard. And so what we do is we just gently file that around, and it starts to take some of the burn marks off of the edge of the wheel rim. And so I'm using the coarse side in this case because we're talking about the edge of the grain, which is a little harder, and we want to take enough material off to smooth it. And if you remember that little sprue that was on there, well, that's also going to have a tiny little notch in there. We want this to be smooth. I'll show you why later. There's that little sprue right there, just a tiny little projection. So as we go around, we'll take that little sprue off. Just rub your finger on. You can feel whether it's flat. A little bit more coming off now. It's nice and smooth. So go around the entire wheel like so, and it generally starts to get fairly smooth and lightens up, and you can see the bird marks lighten up. So we'll do that with each one of the rims. You can see where it's lighter over here, darker there, so that might need a little more filing. You can also take it and do it this way if you prefer. There's a couple of ways of doing this. Just gently, because you don't want to snap anything. The fact that it's a ply does give it some reinforcing so that it doesn't split. And you can see we got a nice light edge now. All those burn marks are almost gone, so we have a nice smooth edge now. I've stained all the parts after sanding them, and I use an alcohol and shoe dye stain. And keep in mind, if you're doing that the alcohol, the rubbing alcohol, does have a water component to it, and as such it will warp anything that's not a plywood. Now these sides and the floorboards are not plywood, they actually just are thin cut sheets, and you can see the warpage. Now that eventually will shrink back, but I want to ensure that it does. So what I do, because you can see the amount of warp that's in there. So what I do is I just stack them together, and then I'll just put some weights. I have some scrap iron bars, and I'll just put weights on them and let them dry over the next few hours, because I don't need to do anything until all of it is done, and then I'll do the next treatment of weathering. Now I want to have these boards appear to have a weathered gray look, so I put a wash over the top of the previously stained boards, varying the gray that's on each one of these planks so there's a little bit of contrast. And what I've done is I've used Dr. Ben's aged driftwood. It's ready to use, and I dissolve it a little bit on the brush with some rubbing alcohol as a thinning agent. And what I'll do is I've just taken and just washed sort of in a wet on wet across the boards. Now even though these are plywood forms here as well, they still have a certain amount of warpage on the ones that are plywood. The ones that are not plywood, of course, will warp. So once I've stained those, then I'll put weights over them again just to keep them flat. Now I've also done the same thing with the wheels, and I've taken the wheels and taken a brush, we dip it into Dr. Ben's weathering stain, and I'll just put a wash on the inside of the rims with this gray stain, just to give it a little bit of weathering. I'll do every one of those, and then what I'll do is I'll just brush over the surface of the rim as well. I'll do that on both sides, and what I end up with is quite a nice weathered rim here. Now these will also warp slightly, so once I've done both sides, I'll stack them in a row and I'll put a weight across them again to flatten them out, make sure they're nice and trim and smooth. I've now assembled the buckboard with the front and back beams in here that will carry the axles, and I've also added a 2x4 edge in here because really those planks need some support. And I put a wash in here, again just highlighting the odd board, and then I've assembled the seat on its springs. These come as plastic castings, and then I've ACC'd them in place. A little tricky doing this, but it all works out, but it's very delicate. And I've added very fine, with a very sharp pointed HB pencil, just tacked little nail holes along these beams in here. Put the front board on there, and very delicate. It's actually worked out well, even though these pieces here are etched the wrong way around on the grain. It really doesn't matter. Buckboards generally are going to be black, so I've put a sort of a blackened peeling paint effect on the planking, and I've painted the wheels black, and the axles will go on here eventually, and inside, outside the spokes, they've all been painted black. I've actually used Floquil weathered black. The next step will be to create the two whiffle trees, I guess they are, that come out from the front of the buckboard, each side of a horse, and the horse would go in here. And there's a template here that they provided, and they provided a couple of strips of brass wire, but the brass wire is very stiff. There's no way I'm going to bend that to that shape and then put a little bow in here. So what I'll do first is I'll get my Bunsen burner out, and I will anneal this part here. Once it's softened, then I can very easily form this curve here around a form, and what I'll do is I'll find something like, this is the cap off the ACC, which is just about the right diameter, and so what I'll do is I'll use this, and I will bend the brass wire around that, and then put a very slight bow in here, and then that will hook onto the front of the carriage like so. It'll be ACC'd in place. I'll then do a search to find a horse that will sit in here with some harness to complete it. Now these wheels, which are all made out of wood in the real thing, actually have a steel tire, a band which obviously is designed to hold this whole thing together and to stand up to the wear and tear. So what I've done is I've taken a piece of thin styrene, and the thickness of the tire, I put a scale rule on, just slightly wider than the tire, and I've cut lengths of styrene that I will use to wrap around each of the rims. But first what I'll do is I'll take those strips and I'm going to paint them with rust, and I'm using, my favorite is Floquil, so I'm using Floquil rust, and I'll paint them and let them dry. Taking these strips of styrene now, and I painted a combination of rust and rail brown on them, so the edges and the top get done. So they're all complete. Now what I've done is I've taken one end, put some crazy glue or ACC on there, and I've tack it onto the edge of the rim. And once it's tacked, I keep adding ACC, and I bring it around, and then I bring it around, and keep the process going. Here is a rim that is now complete, and you can see we've got a rusted steel band around it. Adds quite a dimension to that. Now what I'm going to do is the joint at the bottom doesn't have to be dead accurate, because what I'll probably do is have that joint sitting on the ground once I assemble this. Now the other thing I've done is I've cut the axles and I've blackened the axle, and the kit doesn't give it to you, but there is a turned wood hub on the end, and what happens is just to leave that brass rod through the rim doesn't look very realistic, and I had to find something to put that was going to be a retainer on the end. And so what I found was this brush that comes from the ACC, not the ACC, the styrene bonding glue. I took the brush off the end of it, and that tubing happens to be just about the right size. And so what I've done is I've cut short lengths of that and put those on the end like so, and that'll give a nice hub effect on the end of that wheel. And I'll continue with the other wheel and assemble them, and then we'll attach them to the frame. Now the other thing that I've also done is, just to give it a bit more realism and stability, what I've done is I've added a couple of cross braces, as I said earlier, the 2x4s across there, and then I put a 4x4 across the end running there laterally, just to give it, you know, some semblance of some framing, because obviously the planks, you know, they have to be rigid, so you need some cross members to hold them, and then you need another member going the length of the wagon, and then the wheel will be bonded to the underside of that cross member that was there originally, and it'll look like that. Then I also did a little bit of rusting and metalwork on these springs underneath the seat, because, you know, they kind of bounce. So we're coming along nicely. So that's what the hub looks like before it gets painted. Here's a couple of photographs of a wagon, and you can see how it's weathered. It's a nice gray. And here is one of those wheels, and you can just clearly see that steel band, which is the tire. And there's that hub. The hub is actually made out of wood. It has a steel band around it, but we're not going to do anything like that on this scale. But that's the hub that I was referring to, that we've cut out of a small piece of plastic tubing. Here's another photograph of that same wagon, and you can see there are some outside bracing and so on, which we'll put on, but there's a good shot there of these two wheels with that steel band, and you can see it's quite rusty, and the hub at the end of both wheels. Finally, here's a third photograph, and this one shows the inside of the wagon. Now the floorboards are all gone, but you can see the side planking, and you can see cross members across here, and the lead end of the whiffle tree down here that will go onto the harness of the horses. Cross members, lots of detail in this case with brackets, steel brackets in here, and you can see the bolt connections going up the inside to the outside braces. All of that very clearly shown. Another interesting detail here is an eye on both sides, and it has a chain going across here to help hold those sides in from a heavy load that might tend to push those out. That's a nice detail. I've taken these strips of brass wire that were supplied, and I used the template that is provided, and this template gives you the shape of this whiffletree beam here that comes from the carriage. It has a slight bow in it and then a hook on the end, and that will go into those two holes at the front here. That will allow the horse to sit between these two beams. So what I've done is I've taken that and I've annealed it, and I annealed the brass, and then I used in this particular case I used a pen that had the approximate radius here. I used that to form this piece of brass rod, bend it around there, cut it flush, cut it to length, and then just adjusted it till it fit inside that template, like so. I made two of those, as you can see, and in this case what I've done is I've blackened the brass so that, you know, paint, anything like that, doesn't chip on it, and I'll now put those and glue those into the little hole in the side here. Now I've done a few things that are a little extra on this. I'm not going to take it much beyond what it has now. The wheels get glued to these beams in here, and I'll do that next. But what I'm going to also do is I'm going to put a little beam across here, because this is not enough. The thickness is not enough to hold these, and what I'll do is I'll put a little block of wood in here, and I'll drill those holes so this has a little bit more bearing in there, and so it's a little stronger. As I mentioned before, I put the bracing on the underside. We've got the tires, you know, on all the wheels now. I checked a lot of the websites, and most buckboards did not have a brake. The kit does come with a beam and a pair of brake shoes that would go across there, but most of the buckboards that I've seen don't have brakes. They tended to use the horse and just pull the reins on the horse to pull it to stop the buckboard. So in this case, I'm going to keep it light and just leave it with no brakes, and just the part of the harness in here ready to go. And I have a couple of horses that I'm going to paint next, and set up the reins, and then I'll put a figure in here as well. So at this point I've glued the spacer and the axle onto the back, and the front wheels are assembled, as well as the start of the draft gear, and then the spacer and the mechanism to swivel the front wheels is here. This is the unit here, and there's a small brass screw. But what I've decided to do is just to add a very thin washer, just to give it some relief, to make it easier to swing the wheels around to position it in the future. After assembling the seat, which has 4 pieces, the sides have to be splayed out each way in order to match the back, and then there's the footboard on here. There are little laser cut markings in here. There's no parts given for it, but I assume there's going to be a strap here, so it's just a guide. So I'm going to put a little brace up in here and here to hold the footboard. The other thing which was very neatly done is these steel braces here. They came on a carrier strip across the top. I thought that was quite neat, because all I had to do then was put glue in behind each of these straps. When it was glued, when the glue had dried, I just snapped off that carrier board on each side. The lower ones here are 2x2 blocks, and I had to cut them on a bevel, so just cut them so that they sloped. The only thing disappointing I found with this is the drawing shows this is all planking in here, but in fact there is no laser cut lines here at all, so there is no semblance of any planking. So what I've done is I've used an HB pencil, and I've just lightly drawn a line across there to give just a sense that there's a joint there. The rear panel is probably hinged because there's a couple of pins in here, but I fixed that in place. And overall it's coming along quite nicely. The back wheels are on now, and I just have to do that front assembly, which I'll show you now. Well, as good as these little laser kits are, I've been a little disappointed because there have been some things missing that I've had to replace. Also, this screw that was supplied to go in here so that the draft gear and the front wheels could turn was too small for the hole that was laser drilled in there. I've had to replace the screw here with another fine screw that I already had, and now it works and it revolves. So that was a bit of a disappointment. Amongst a few others that I've discovered, you know, these straps, for example, are not here. There's numerous little things that are missing. There's the other thing that I find very disappointing is the way the axle in all these kits is just glued onto the end. This cross beam in here. There's no bracket, there's no shackle or anything like that secures it in there or gives it a sense that there is a mounting mechanism. So that's a little disappointing. Could have been a little casting or something like that. But even some tubing cutting half that could cap that. So I'll have to do those myself, get some appropriate size tubing. The heavy freight wagon is just about complete now, and you'll notice what I've done is I've added some things from the kit. The kit comes with brakes, but no mechanism to work the brakes. Typically what will happen is there's a big beam comes up here, and they often will push it with their foot, and it comes down, and what I've done is just taken an assortment of parts that I have in my spare box for leftover brake rigging and so on, and I've made up a mechanism in here so that when this lever is pushed forward up here, it pushes this back here, which moves the fulcrum back here, which in turn has this steel plate here and pushes the cross beam here, which is the brake carriers, up against the wheels. So that added a nice little bit of detail on the underside, which you can just see, as when you look on the underside. Also, I did do some additional bracing on the underside because the planks are running this way, so they have to be braced, and then there's a reinforcing beam going down the side. So I've added all those parts onto it. The wiffle tree beam is at the front, and as I mentioned earlier, I've had to replace the screw that was underneath here because it was way too small. Put another screw in there, and it now swivels, so it works nicely. And I've ordered 2 collared horses from Aspen Models, which will go on each side here, and I'll put a wiffle tree across the back of them and put a harness across, and then I'll put a rider up in the top. And so that's basically complete. Now these kits, initially the base kit is not intended to be a super detail kit. It's sufficient to give the impression, but it leaves you a lot of latitude to do what I've done here, to add whatever amount of additional detail you want. And I think that'll make a very nice wagon. These are often painted, but in my case I'm wanting to have everything in a sort of a weathered finish. You'll notice that I still put in steel bands around the wheels, which they're supposed to have. I also added a hub on all the wheels, which didn't have a part in the kit. I used, if you remember, I mentioned that I used the brush from styrene adhesive, took the brush off, and that piece of tubing here just happens to be the right size for a press fit. So I just cut these off and then press fitted them onto the ends of the axle, and it gives quite a nice feeling for a hub. And then I've just painted it. Put some additional parts inside, make it a working wagon. I'm now working on the hay wagon, and as you see, I've assembled the two sides, the front board here, and of course this footboard up here is in the kit, but it's not labeled on the instructions, and it's made sense to me to put it up so that they have something to put their foot on, so I've included it on the front there. I've made the seat ready to go on top of the springs on each side, and the brake beams are here, but there is no beam to hold the two of them together across the underside of the body. Of course, the underside of the body is, again, like the other kits, just flat, there's no detail. So I'm going to put in some bracing, some beams and cross members in here, which are supposed to hold the planking, of course. And then I'll install a brake system like I did on the other wagon. I've made up a brake arm here. I've tapered it at the end like the other one. I made it round, because what they'll do is they'll push it forward, which pushes the brakes back against the wheels. So I'll add that later on. These are some assorted parts from my freight cars that I will use for the clevises and mechanism for the brake gear underneath. Some additional pieces in here which will be bracing that I'll bevel and I'll install on these marked lines here, and I'll put some bracing up in here to hold the football on that angle. The wheels already have the tires on and ready to go, and I've got the plastic tubes cut for the hubs on the end of the wheel. Again, I am disappointed that some of the scribe siding is not, at least on the inside, but at least the outside does show the two planks. And the underside just needs some beefing up, and I think the underside framing will help that, especially from the side view. I've now assembled framing on the underside with some cross members. I put the brake beam across here with the brake shoes on the ends. I've also created the brake lever, same as before. There's a steel bar goes across there that holds it with its limits. Comes back down here. I've created a little support here and put the fulcrum bracket in here. Again, it's from the freight car miscellaneous parts that I have, and you can see it'll add a nice bit of underbody detail. The wheels, of course, are now installed on the axles, and the plastic tubing for the hubs is in place. The seat's installed. I'm just going to now put in the beveled braces that go across the ends of the boards that are marked there to support these planks. And I'm about to finish the little bit of mechanism and the fulcrum across here for the brake lever. Okay, I've completed the sides now with the braces down the side. The brake rigging is all now assembled and in place, and touch-ups and so on.
are complete. All I have to do now is put a load in there, and when I get the horses, I'll be putting the horses on. There'll be a pair of horses that'll sit along the side here. I'll build a wiffle tree later on that'll go across there that they will be attached to. Just put a load in next, and we're done. So I've now got the loads complete, and in here from Schaumburg I've got barrels, wooden barrels, and I've painted them and weathered them, and they're now installed inside this wagon. And this one over here, also from Schaumburg, are sacks, and these will be sacks of grain. I've weathered those and painted them, and that wagon also has its load now. And all we have to do now is get the 2 sets of horses at each end, and we'll be ready to go.